Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
Our speaker this evening is Dr. Louis Abramson. He is an adjunct physical scientist at RAND, a place, by the way, that, well, we don't know how much longer it'll still be in business, since it's pretty much dependent on government grants. His research focuses on trends in unsheltered homelessness, which I think he'll probably describe to you. He works on such projects as the counts of the unsheltered, and he also does program evaluation of local efforts to reduce homelessness. He is both a researcher and an activist. For instance, he chairs a 5-neighborhood homeless coalition covering communities in Mid-East Side LA. In 2022, Louis Abramson unsuccessfully ran for California State Assembly in District 51, which is Central and West LA. And he did quite well for someone who is relatively unknown. So we might want to encourage him to try again. Tonight, Dr. Abramson will speak to us on key trends and projections in LA County homelessness. Please welcome Louis Abramson.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Louis Abramson, and I'm really thrilled to be at this illustrious group of folks. You're very, very engaged, which the part of me that I'm here as a RAND researcher, which will limit a little bit about what I'm able to talk about, but it's thrilling to see such enthusiasm focused locally. That's always a good thing. So I'm going to talk today. First of all, actually, before I do, I hear y'all have a homelessness committee. So are there any members of the homelessness committee here tonight? Okay, fantastic. I'll expect you to ask lots of questions. And I'm going to disappoint you a little bit up front because I'm mostly going to focus on LA County, although there is one slide on Orange County, which is very favorable to Orange County. I'm going to talk hopefully for no more than an hour tonight. As was introduced, I'm an astrophysicist. Well, I'll just get into it. I'm trained as an astrophysicist, which means I'm kind of a quantitative guy. I like numbers, and I feel comfy in numbers, and I know not everybody does. So when I get to the numbers-y part, which will be a lot of this, I will make sure I explain what they mean in human terms as well. But as Sue articulated, I don't like to call myself a community organizer, but I have no better name for myself. I do grassroots homelessness outreach in my neighborhood of Hollywood. I chair the board of a nonprofit. I was on the founding board of another surrounding homelessness. And I served for a time in a strange elected capacity in Los Angeles called the neighborhood councils, and then I ran for state assembly. So I have I wear lots of hats. And I am not formally trained in homelessness research, but I am trained in these other modalities that are quite complementary to it. And as you'll, I think, all see, and I think probably know, homelessness is such a multifaceted crisis that I believe the more perspectives we bring to bear, the better. So I'm going to give you lots of numbers, but feel free, probably after the official Q&A, you can ask me about my experiences in these political governance and boots-on-the-ground service roles. I was brought into RAND really to work on a program I'll touch on sort of in the middle of the talk called LA Leads, which stands for a longitudinal enumeration and demographic survey of 3 communities in Los Angeles. Sure, I'll slow down. Thank you. 3 communities in Los Angeles that are very heavily impacted by homelessness. That's my community of Hollywood, Skid Row, which I think everybody has heard of, and then Venice on the west side. Very different communities, although displaying interestingly similar trends. So you may have heard of the count, the annual homeless count. Well, we have been doing that every other month in these locations for 4 years, almost, three and a half years. So we have very extensive data that allows us to say things that are interesting and new and I think quite powerful. So we'll get to that later in the talk. What I hope to cover with you tonight is a grounding in the basic statistical reality of homelessness in LA County, your neighbor to the north. Then we'll dig below the top line numbers to look at a few populations of focus that I think will be of interest to this community, vulnerable populations that are often hidden by the top line numbers. I'll then talk about some of the insights we've gleaned from that project I just mentioned, LA Leads. If we have time, I'll talk about some future housing projections, some initiatives that are going to incentivize or mandate the creation of housing to hopefully bring some of the unhoused folks in our communities inside. And then at the very, very end, very briefly, I'll touch on some of the immediate and perhaps future impacts of course, the devastating fires of earlier this year. So we'll start with just the lay of the land in LA County. And leading into that, I want to, as was prompted, I want to provide just a couple of definitions so that we're all on the same page. So I think everybody kind of understands what homelessness is. It's that you don't sleep, really technically you don't sleep in a domicile that you own or rent or have permission to dwell in a private sense. There are two kinds of homelessness that are important to distinguish from each other. There's sheltered homelessness, which means that even though you don't have a home, you do go to a built structure that is designed for human habitation at night, a shelter, which sometimes we call interim housing. And you may have heard about, you may have ideas about what these are from history, congregate shelters where there are many people on cots in the same room. But increasingly, we are bringing in motels and other more formal structures into the interim housing portfolio because we're trying to get the other kind of homelessness, unsheltered homelessness, down very rapidly. Unsheltered homelessness is folks who spend their nights in places not meant for human habitation. So this could be dwelling in a tent, in a car, in an RV, or just rough sleeping on the sidewalk with nothing at all, which is increasingly common in LA County. This is the kind of homelessness that makes a lot of headlines. This is the kind of homelessness that disturbs lots of neighbors. And it's become a special focus of many policymakers in Los Angeles because it is the bulk of the homeless population in Los Angeles. 70% of homeless folks in Los Angeles County are unsheltered. And also they're the most vulnerable members of the population. So I will be talking, sometimes I will group these together. If I don't make it explicit, I'll be talking about both kinds together. But as necessary, I will break it out by either unsheltered or sheltered homeless folks. And you may also hear me refer to people as unhoused. They are synonymous. I'll either say, homeless people, people experiencing homelessness, or unhoused people. My one slide on Orange County. So in Orange County, the situation at present is that there are about 7,000 people experiencing homelessness in a county of about 3 million. Of those, about 4,000 people, so 4 out of 7, are unsheltered, meaning they are sleeping in these informal dwellings or rough sleeping on the street. The way I like to think about this, so here's your number from 2024, right over there on the end. This really means that Orange County is like missing 4,000 interim housing beds or 4,000 housing units. We, as a society, have sort of been in a housing construction deficit for many years, and that has kind of agglomerated into this housing debt that manifests as people living on the street. But I want to say, while 4,000 might seem like a lot, or 7,000 might seem like a lot, this is a county that's only 3 times smaller than Los Angeles, and as I'm about to show you, you have 1/10 the homeless population of Los Angeles. So where I live in LA County, right now, as of the latest count, there are 75,000 people experiencing homelessness. In the city of Los Angeles, it's like 48,000, which means 1 out of every 100 residents of the city of Los Angeles is homeless. In my neighborhood, at one point in 2019, it was 1 out of every 30 people in my neighborhood. Yes, so it's a crisis, and it's been rightly recognized as one and as an emergency. But where we really are is it's this 52,000 people who are unsheltered. This is our 52,000 bed deficit as opposed to your 4,000 bed deficit. So we're going to try to, most of what I'm going to say tonight is not really uplifting, but I think Orange County can rightfully say it's doing better than Los Angeles in this problem in this crisis, and we can talk about why probably after time. How did we get here? Well, these are data from a website that tracks housing production and homelessness across California. The orange dots are the homeless counts as a function of time going back to 2013, and the blue dots are our total interim housing, so shelter and permanent supportive housing, permanent housing, number of units to house them. And as you can just see, for the past, over 10 years, 3 people have become homeless as every 2 beds are created. So homelessness, the growth in homelessness is outstripping our construction of the thing that's supposed to end homelessness, which is homes. And honestly, I could leave now, because as long as the blue line is not as steep as the orange line, we're never going to get ahead of it. Now, there are many, many things being done to try to steepen the blue line, and I have some confidence it will steepen. But until we're building homes faster than people are losing their homes, we're always going to be in this deficit situation. Another way to put this, well, so that's the same way to put it, but another way to put it is we currently have enough interim housing and permanent housing to house 2014's homelessness population. So we're 10 years behind. That is where we are. This does not mean that the system is not doing anything. Part of what's difficult about homelessness from a governance perspective is the system is working really hard. And in fact, the system is working harder than ever, and its outcomes, in some sense, are better than ever. So what this bar chart is a measurement of the number of people that LA's homelessness system has actually put in permanent housing every year, and you can see it is going up. So every year since 2018, we've housed basically 20,000 people or more per year. So if no one became homeless, we could house the whole population in between 3 and 4 years. But people are becoming homeless all the time because rents are high, poverty is extremely widespread. You should know that once you adjust for housing costs, California has the highest poverty rate in the country, and LA County has the highest poverty rate in California. So we have a higher poverty rate than states you may think of as quite poor because of our housing costs. So the system is working very hard. It's just the external conditions are extremely difficult. But last year it was the first time that it looks like the system housed more people than fell into homelessness. So again, it's difficult not to come away it's difficult not to come away depressed. It's also difficult not to be antagonistic towards the system because we hear all the time about audits that return massive unallocated funds, or budgets are going up faster than homelessness. So it's easy to beat up on the system, and that's your prerogative. But we should recognize that the system is in fact doing things, and it's doing a lot of things, and we have just external conditions that are very challenging. This is not to say things could not improve in the system. They absolutely could. But I just don't want you to think that we're not housing anybody. Yeah, so as I just mentioned, so some numbers here. This is from McKinsey, a study they put out last year. The 2 charts, the big blue chart shows you the increase in homelessness budgets for the Homelessness Authority in LA County. That is not the entire homelessness governance system in LA County. I'll talk about that in a second, but it's a proxy. So according to McKinsey, the Los Angeles Homelessness Services Authority, which we call LAHSA, LAHSA's budget has increased by 13 times since 2015, and homelessness has increased at the same time by 60%. So we're spending more money than ever, and yet the problem is getting worse than ever. But I want to just for you to see these numbers so that you have a perspective. LA City's 2024 homelessness budget was $1.3 billion. In 2013, when Eric Garcetti took office, that number was $10 million. So the homelessness budget of the city of Los Angeles has increased by a factor of 100 in a little over 10 years. The LA County Homelessness Initiative, which does things like coordinate healthcare services and housing services, that budget's $610 million. You can see the numbers here. In total, California has spent $24 billion on homelessness between 2019 and 2024. So I react in shock to that number, but then I'm an astrophysicist by training, and we, for a long time, were building this thing called the James Webb Space Telescope. And the James Webb Space Telescope, which is now flying and it's behind the moon, it was notorious for budget overruns. It started out being costed at $500 million, and it wound up at like $11.4 billion, which is about the cost of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. So we've spent $24 billion on homelessness, or we've spent 2 Nimitz-class aircraft. We've bought 2 aircraft carriers. I don't know if that makes you feel better, but it's, those aircraft carriers are going to housing tens of thousands of people per year, even though it seems like we're not catching up. Those are different ways to think about this number. Nobody knows how much this is supposed to cost. It clearly costs an awful lot the way we're doing it, but nobody's done this under the conditions we're facing. So the numbers are difficult to benchmark, but there they are. Yeah, I wanted to make sure I talked about this too, because it is important to recognize that, these folks are people. Like, we say people experiencing homelessness to make sure that everybody knows that they're people, but really, they are human beings like the rest of us, and when they're on the street, conditions are very, very tough. And unsurprisingly, if you're on the street for many years, as is the norm now, you're exposed to many turbulent things, and those can cut your lifespan short. So another trend that's been increasing over the past few years is mortality amongst unhoused folks. This graph here is from the LA County Public Health Department, and it just shows the number of people who are experiencing homelessness who have died every year on the street since 2014. And as you can see, last year it was in 2022, it was about 2,400 people. So that's about 6 people per day dying on the street, which is a rate that's 3.6 times higher than it was in 2014. Why? Drug overdose are becoming the dominant cause of mortality. This is not to say that drug usage is the dominant cause of homelessness, because it's not. Poverty is the dominant cause of homelessness. But once you're on the street, your reliance on stimulants, for example, will go up because you might want to stay awake at night for rational reasons. But this combined with the rise of fentanyl has really spiked street incidences. So there's that like jump in 2019 was really caused by fentanyl rising amongst methamphetamine usage. So it really is a crisis. I mean, it's a public health crisis, it's a personal health crisis, it's a housing crisis, which makes it a land use crisis. It's a governance crisis because we have cities, counties, joint city-county agencies, the state, the feds, Housing and Urban Development pays for a lot of this. It's a jurisdictional nightmare. And that's why I was talking at the beginning about it being so multifaceted. Homelessness is the nexus of like all of the other governance systems that we have and the way we have physically constructed our cities. And so you can imagine how many stakeholders there are in these discussions and how many regulatory barriers there are and how many incentives there are in various directions that make progress hard. Okay, so that's just the foundations. I'm now going to dive under those numbers a little bit to talk about specific groups of folks who are maybe interesting to this to y'all, to kind of show some of the same trends but broken out into specific subpopulations. So we're going to go through a lot of charts now. I know that might be boring. On each of these slides, you'll see a top chart, which is going to have lines on it that are mostly rising to the right. And that's the total population of these various subgroups that are experiencing homelessness. And then below that, you'll see another chart, and that'll be the fraction of the homeless population that belongs to those groups. So the first is important just to see, like, are more women experiencing homelessness now than they were before? And the second is important to see, are women a higher fraction of all of unhoused people than they were before? Are they becoming more overrepresented than they were before? i.e., are there inequities that might be changing over time versus are they tracking the rise of the general population? So there'll be lots of lines. Most of them will go up, which means it's not getting better, but some of them won't. So we'll start with a group that was already mentioned by Sue. We'll start with women and transgender folks. So the blue line in these plots are women, and again, the top is the total number of women experiencing homelessness, and the bottom, total number of those groups experiencing homelessness, and the bottom is as a portion of the homeless population. So for both of these groups, we've seen like 40 to 50% increases since 2018 in the total number of folks experiencing homelessness that are either women or transgender. That's 24,000 women. We'll get to domestic violence in a second. Like 1,400 folks who are trans. But these have been roughly stable over time. So they are becoming homeless at the same rate as the general population, which is not true of all of the groups we'll look at. Of course, the rates of women in the general population is 50%. And in the transgender population is estimated in Los Angeles County to be about 0.7%. So transgender folks are like 3 times overrepresented in the homeless population, and women are not they're underrepresented compared to their general. There are fewer women experiencing. The proportion of women who are homeless is lower than the proportion of the general population. Moving to Black and Latino folks, there are different stories here, although in different ways. So the Latino, I think both populations have risen, but the Black population has tracked the homeless population, whereas Latino homelessness has really increased, both in a raw sense and as a fraction of the homeless population. For Black folks, they make up 9% of the general population in Los Angeles County and about 32% of unhoused folks. So they're very, very massively overrepresented. And Latino homelessness has risen, this was so shocking to me, 76% since 2018 to now 31,000 out of 75,000 people. And they are kind of approaching their population of their share of the general population. So that's racial minorities, or racial groups. And then I wanted to touch on youth and people aged 55 plus. It's broken out into 55 plus as opposed to seniors. But these are 2 special populations, obviously, because of their vulnerabilities. The first group we call transition-aged youth. It's folks 18 to 24. Obviously, a lot of them are coming out of foster care. And it's a precarious time because you're technically an adult, but you are not yet fully your cognitive faculties are not yet fully developed, and if you've had childhood trauma, all sorts of things mean that it's a special category of people. And the system has a dedicated system to help transition-aged youth that terminates at 24, 25. So these populations, transition-aged youth are something of a success story here. They actually have not seen an increase over time. Now, that's good. It's difficult to count early 20-somethings because they do a lot of couch surfing. They're very mobile. But the providers that serve them are probably the most coordinated, like folks in Venice, folks in Skid Row, folks in Hollywood, all talk to each other about this group, and they're very good at keeping track of them. But seniors is really the scary one. At one point, seniors were the fastest growing portion of the homeless population. And again, it's folks on fixed incomes who can't afford housing, or folks who become disabled, or folks who don't have social networks that can support them. And we've seen an almost 50% rise in people aged 55 plus since 2018. So now almost 20,000 people experiencing homelessness are seniors. And that's something that we all think about. There are dedicated services to seniors, but they're not quite as, in my opinion, and this might not be accurate, but are not quite as robust as those for youth. Okay, this is a busy slide, but I wanted also to talk about substance use disorder, serious mental illness, folks living with HIV and AIDS, and also folks who are fleeing domestic violence. So these are people for whom domestic violence was causal to their homelessness. And estimated across California, this is from an LA Times article, 1 out of 5 women experiencing homelessness is homeless because they are fleeing a domestic violence or intimate partner violence situation. And that is the blue line on these charts, and you can see it is rising. So we're losing ground on the domestic violence front. The same is true of folks with substance use disorder, which is, now this is not folks whose substance use disorder was causal to their homelessness, I don't believe. But anyway, that corresponds, you remember we learned about the mortality statistics from before. So those two groups are becoming more prevalent. They're rising faster than the unhoused population, although folks with serious mental illness, which is sort of schizophrenia, severe depression, psychoactive disorders, that is about stable. And HIV and AIDS has risen a lot, folks with HIV and AIDS, to 1,300 people, but it's not increasing as a fraction of the population. So again, let's see, what's next? This is the last grim statistic, I think. I wanted to talk a little bit about we talked about unsheltered people before. Those numbers are rising, but the share is not rising. So as I say, you know, we're building that housing we're building the interim shelters, we're building places to bring folks who are on the street, just not fast enough, but we're keeping up such that about 70% of the unhoused population is living on the street, and it has been for years and years. That number's been pretty stable. What is changing is chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness refers to people who have been homeless for more than a year. So these are folks who, you know, the best way to end homelessness is to end it sort of rapid. You catch someone as soon as they lose their housing, and you can either get them an injection of cash, or there are systems called rapid rehousing. If you catch them early, you can conduct them to, hopefully, an awaiting housing asset or an interim housing asset before the other issues that accrue when you're on the street compound to make their case harder. But now, as you can see, the blue line is people who are chronically homeless for more than a year. That number is going up, and that's indicative of just the fact that, like, we're keeping people, as we are not building housing fast enough, we are keeping people homeless for longer and longer and longer. Even if they're homeless in a shelter, the time they are staying in the shelter is growing longer and longer and longer. So people are just not, their journey out of homelessness is not concluding. And this is a challenge because, you know, you can imagine how many things correlate with chronicity. That's what we call chronic homelessness. If you're flying in an airplane and you're going through a short thunderstorm, that doesn't feel so bad. But if you're flying through a gigantic hurricane the size of the Gulf of Mexico, worse things can happen. Okay, so that was a lot, and we're going to see a few more graphs, but some of the trends that I'm going to talk about next, which come from RAND, this is the stuff I actually work on, are a little bit more hopeful. And some, even if they're not hopeful, point to very specific kinds of interventions we can do to make things better. So hopefully that will be a little glimmer of sunshine in this talk. As I mentioned, what this survey is, folks here have mentioned already that they've gone out and done counts at night to just enumerate the unhoused population to see how many resources we need to draw down from the feds or whomever. RAND has been doing this, as I say, every other month at least since September of 2021 in these three very impacted areas. The middle big blob is Hollywood. That's where I live. The little triangle to the right is Skid Row, which is the densest. It's both the highest number of unhoused people as a neighborhood and the smallest neighborhood. And then Venice over on the west, near the ocean. The reason these are interesting neighborhoods is that they kind of have, or are seen to have, very different populations. Venice is known for being where youth go, lots of youth hanging out at the beach, also lots of RV dwelling. Hollywood is kind of a smorgasbord of everybody, although also lots of youth, because when people, most people who become homeless in California are from California, but those who aren't, they hear Hollywood, and they're like, oh, I want to go be a movie star. And then they get to Hollywood, and they realize it's not where they make the movies, and they get stuck. And then Skid Row has a couple of different factors that highlight it. First, it's just the sheer size of the population. It's like 4,000 people experiencing homelessness in that area. Second, the sort of like infrastructure. So Skid Row was designed, in quotes, as a way of co-locating all the services with all the homeless people. So the idea was you're going to direct unhoused folks to Skid Row, but that's also where all the services are going to be. And in fact, that is largely true. Huge amounts of permanent supportive housing, huge amounts of medical clinics. There are lots of services on Skid Row, but it's also Skid Row, which is a very chaotic environment. It's very encamped, lots of tents. So these were picked because they were clearly going to be areas of governmental focus, but also because they're interesting. And we did not just the enumerations, but we did surveys. We asked people, how long have you been homeless? Where did you lose your housing? Have you ever been diagnosed with substance use disorder? Do you have a job? When was the last time you saw a caseworker? All that stuff. So we can really kind of get at, what is it like to be homeless? What is a month in the life of an unhoused Angelino? And are there insights we can draw from that to sort of deploy more resources more effectively, make sure those dollars get transmitted into health outcomes or job outcomes or housing outcomes more efficiently than they are today? And okay, so now you're just going to see lots of numbers, but I thought some of these might be interesting. So the average income of the people we study is over $500 a month, and some of that is general relief, which is welfare from the county. But over 75% reported some kind of informal employment. 36% were seeking work, and I forget how many people are like formally employed here. It says 10%, I think. So it's a mix. And if you're living in a car, you might be able to get to a job, versus if you're totally rough sleeping, you probably can't. So I guess what I'm trying to do here is show that the unsheltered population is like not a monolith. None of this population is a monolith, and there are some interesting things to draw from that. In terms of the statistics we were talking about before, roughly 60% report that they've been formally diagnosed with a mental illness. Now this number for the population writ large is like 21%. So this feeds into sort of like a discrepancy. This is an important thing. This feeds into a discrepancy between what normal human beings think of as like a mental illness and what the system defines as a mental illness. So like the system defines persistent and severe psychosis or persistent and severe schizophrenia as a serious mental illness. If you see someone decompensating on the street and having an argument with themselves and like throwing something into the street, they may be having a bad high. It may be drug-induced psychosis, which does not count. So depending on how the government wants to, depending on which statistic the government wants to portray, these numbers can be wildly different. And depending on which clinicians see you, whether or not it's a trained psychiatrist. So I just want to say that's one of the reasons why the numbers move around like this. They can move around, but also there are definitional issues. 26% were arrested in the past year, which means that every 4 years, everybody's getting arrested once. And almost 1 in 3 have reported overdosing in their lifetime. And this has actually prompted, a policy change, which is that now basically all outreach workers are deployed with Narcan to revive people, even volunteer ones like mine. And street medicine, i.e., we're going to get there in a second, I think. We'll get there in a second. Street medicine, bringing doctors to the street to help people get well, has also become a big deal, and it's working. So in health, our sample showed that at least half have been homeless for about 3 years. That's that chronicity measure. They've been, half of the people who we're talking to are not just chronically homeless, they're chronically homeless times 3. Most have resided in their current location for more than 3 years, which means they could have lost their housing in the neighborhood that they live in. And only, a third were not in California before they became homeless. So they are actually our neighbors, or they might come from other places in California. They're overwhelmingly Californians. 22% lost their housing due to an eviction. I thought that was interesting because I don't know if that number's high or low. There's been a huge amount. You may remember from COVID, there were the eviction stops, eviction moratoriums. It's a very hot button political issue about how much you can pressure landlords to not evict people. Clearly, evictions will cause homelessness, but I honestly have no sense of whether or not this is a big number or a small number. It's not 100%. It's not 0%. But this complicates things like, okay, well, we'll stop evictions and then there won't be any more homelessness. Not necessarily true, it looks like. You'll catch some, but there are multiple pathways into homelessness, which again makes this so challenging. You know, the women who were fleeing domestic violence were not evicted, but it's thousands of people who are becoming homeless through that channel. 63% have searched for housing. I believe this is in the last year. People are trying to get off the street. It's fraught and difficult, but most people, if they can work with their caseworker long enough, do try to advance out of homelessness. What does it mean to work with a caseworker? This is a very interesting question. You don't need to worry about these numbers. These numbers are for when you get to look at this PDF later. But 30% in our sample saw their caseworker in the past week. That doesn't mean that 30% had like a rigorous interview and had medical stuff scheduled or like their Social Security taken care of, got their tax did. The most common service reported was they got water and snacks. But I highlight this because in Hollywood, where I live, we're doing really well. We have the highest number in Hollywood. 40% of folks in Hollywood see their caseworker every 7 days, and we're very proud of that. My Rand hat was off for that. My Rand hat comes back on. 21%, 1 in 5, haven't seen a caseworker in over 90 days, which means that's a quarter. That's a full quarter. And these are the statistics that tell you why things break. So these are numbers I'm throwing at you, but the next one is that 22%, only a quarter report consistent engagement with one case manager. Over half have seen more than one caseworker, and a fifth have seen none. So what does it mean to have to tell your story to, some of these people report seeing more than 5 caseworkers in a year. You're starting from scratch every time you have that conversation. They don't know who you are, they don't know your story, they have to learn about your triggers from square one. They don't understand your relationships to other community organizations who could be brought into the care system. That's not on you, that's on the system. It's also not on the system, it's on the work. This is hard work. You know, caseworkers are not paid very well. Rand has a study about that. You can read all about quantitatively how not well they're paid. I wasn't on that study, but it's good. And you're seeing people at their most vulnerable who have suffered physical injury, are dealing with substance use problems perhaps, or an acute mental illness, or who have just been let down before and are very difficult to build rapport with. And this is demoralizing. So you have a system, the system is in trauma as the people it is dealing with are in trauma. And that's where we are. And I think that statistic about seeing 5 caseworkers, some organizations lose 30% of their caseworkers every year, and you've got to rehire. Imagine the drag on human resources that is, to have to hire 3 people for the same job every year. So these are parts of the reasons that money curve keeps going up faster than the outcomes we would want to see generated go up. One bright spot, almost 6 in 10 people report having received medical services on the street in the past month. And this is due to a huge investment in street medicine, USC, UCLA, other teams. They go into the neighborhoods, they find folks on the street, they get them care in place. They also can become their primary care providers, which is like important for all sorts of downstream. You need your primary care provider to refer you to things like an orthopedic surgeon or a dermatologist or a psychiatrist. If you don't have a primary care practitioner, or if you live in Venice and your primary care practitioner is on Skid Row, you're never going to get that referral. So street medicine is very important, and it's a bright spot. Okay, I'm not gonna talk about this. This is really where my contribution has come in. So one of the things that we elected a new mayor in 2022, and the number one issue homelessness has been the number one issue amongst LA voters for a long time. So the mayor came in with a mandate to execute on homelessness, and she had very ambitious plans. One of them was to get more people than ever into motels, into interim housing, off the street now. And she was going to do it by changing the way the system works. So the housing system was and is designed to operate based on need. your caseworker sees you, they do an assessment, they figure out your physical health needs, your age, pre-existing medical conditions, your mental health needs, et cetera, and they give you a score. And everybody who's unhoused has a score, and they just rank the list from the highest score to the lowest score, and as soon as a house or an interim shelter bed comes online, they give it to the person at the top slot. That's called the coordinated entry system, and it's how the system usually works. And everybody hates it because it's slow, and if you've got a person right here who needs a house, they are not necessarily going to be at the top of the line. But it's considered more equitable than, for example, a place-based approach where there's a really, really huge encampment on this sidewalk and all the neighbors are going crazy, and also it's bad. Like, there are people getting sick there, the residents, there are people in extremis. Can't we just move all these folks right now? We can see them. We can outreach to them. They're right here. Also, they have a community, perhaps. They have social bonds that will help them stay in housing stably. So the mayor decided to push on a place-based approach. And I said, I didn't mean it was more, the coordinated entry system, the need-based approach was designed to be more equitable, but it's just a policy choice. Are you going to focus on encampments, which have totally rational reasons to focus on them? They're big, so in the same amount of time, you're talking to a lot more unhoused people and you're dealing with a lot more need. They're, I say they have perhaps some social cohesion. They're also politically quite salient. They're visible, so it has multiple reasons, clinical and political, to address encampments. So she did. And so how do you know there's an encampment? It's got a tent. So what we have seen, what this graph is showing, finally to get to the stupid graph, is that over the course of the last few years, the blue line are the number of people who are either in tents or in cars. And that number has been going down. And in fact, you can see kind of recently, towards the right, it went down a lot. Well, that was because the mayor decided to target encampments. This is her policy decision. The purple line are the people who are rough sleeping, meaning they're in a sleeping bag at best. They have no shelter whatsoever of any kind. That number has been rising. So I am not making a statement that these are causally connected, but when you have a place-based strategy, if you're not in the place, you don't get strategized for. So as the mayor has removed tents, the population that is homeless has become dominated by people who don't have tents. And there's no strategy for that. So there's this interesting dilemma of, it's very efficient to go after folks living in encampments, and by go after, I mean try to address and house and give services to. I don't mean necessarily police. But that means that the remaining population will be those for whom there is no strategy. And in fact, we're seeing that in the numbers, where now, basically, like the not tent population is now the overwhelming majority of unsheltered people. And that is a new regime. That is not the circumstances that we have been living in Los Angeles, and in my opinion, will need a strategy to address that going forward if we are really interested in ending unsheltered homelessness versus merely bringing people who are living in encampments inside. Okay. That, I think, is some good news coming up. Good news coming up. That should be most of the downer stuff. I didn't start my watch, but what am I looking on in time? I got like 15 minutes? 10. 10? Okay, great. So that's all the folks who are out there. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to build all this housing? What's making us build all this housing? Are there new laws? Are there new initiatives? Well, the answer to all that is yes. And I thought I would frame this. The frame I would use for this is the Olympics. So we all know in 2028, LA is going to have the Olympics. A little bit of Oklahoma City, but mostly Los Angeles is going to have the Olympics. And the world will be here, and they will have their eyes on us. And I think that this is, you can read LA Times articles about this is putting pressure for us to make meaningful gains in homelessness. So ask yourself the question, how many unsheltered people could we bring indoors by 2028, which is just 3 years away? And I've done that exercise for you, and we'll just walk through it quickly. This slide just shows a bunch of things that have happened in like the last year that are forcing Los Angeles to build housing in ways that it hasn't before. So the first is do you remember, who here has heard the name Judge Carter? Yeah, lots of folks, Judge Carter. The homelessness crew all knows Judge Carter. Judge Carter started in Orange County. He's a federal district judge, and he was so upset with how Orange County was handling homelessness, he came down here and made a bunch of federal orders and made Orange County do better. He has done the same thing in Los Angeles, spurred by a lawsuit from a coalition of folks in downtown LA. And he has mandated that we build, I think it's 6,000 beds by mid-2026. These don't have to be permanent housing, but shelter beds. So that's coming. Affordable housing production has doubled in the city of Los Angeles since 2019. That's good news. We're buying motel rooms for this mayor's initiative for Inside Safe. And I should have said, our existing capacity in the shelter system is 20%. There's thousands of beds that are not filled on any given night because we don't have an efficient system for filling them. So there's capacity. What will this all get us to? Well, forget this. The point is, can we get to, the question is, can we house half of today's unsheltered population by the Olympics? So this is where the alliance, this is where the Judge Carter federal settlement is going to get us to. That's 10,000 beds short. But we're adding affordable housing to it. Now we're only 6,000 beds short. If we double the number of motel rooms that Inside Safe is using, we're getting a little closer. This is all high side possible stuff. If we use all of the existing interim housing that we have, we're getting really close. Now, these things won't always, and don't worry about that, that's another thing. These assets won't always be filled, but you can see that by 2028, if you just take existing laws, existing initiatives that are on the books, we get to 40%, which would be a big deal. It's not half would be better, but it's, 14,000, between 12,300 people. That's a lot of people. So are we going to move this fast? No, and I'll tell you why in a second. But this is sort of a ceiling that we could reach. And there were some other initiatives too. In last March, does anybody remember voting for Prop 1 or voting against Prop 1? Prop 1 was Newsom's big mental health, behavioral health initiative. That's going to 3,000 beds for the city of Los Angeles, maybe, and then there's a bunch of other affordable housing stuff here. So there are things happening. There are some headwinds. Okay, so affordable housing production has doubled, but this is a plot of just housing permits that happen in the city of Los Angeles every year, and they're going down in general. So that's tough. We made a real effort to make it we deregulated affordable housing in the city of Los Angeles aggressively. Under the mayor passed a thing called Executive Directive 1, which said if you're a developer and you want to build 100% affordable housing, you have to get permitted automatically in 60 or 90 days. You jump to the top of the line, the bureaucracy is going to get out of your way, you're going to get all your entitlements real quick. The city has pared that initiative back in terms of the number of places you can build, which is that's another headwind. And then I did want to talk just in the last few seconds we have here about Grants Pass. Has anybody heard of the Grants Pass decision? The homelessness crew knows what it's talking about, yeah. So the Supreme Court last year ruled that cities can impose restrictions on where people can dwell overnight. And by impose restrictions, I mean they can demand that you relocate without an alternative place for you to be. The previous the previous district court, 9th district court ruling was unless they have a shelter bed for you, they can't give you a ticket and ask you to move along. Now you can, which is driving fears that there will be pushes from other jurisdictions into places that are working hard like Los Angeles. I don't think Orange County would ever push people up into Los Angeles, but you could imagine that counties that are hostile or are less interested in developing robust homelessness policies will start to push folks into counties that are more amenable to it, which is just going to increase the number of people who LA sees becoming homeless every year. So these are some headwinds. And I should say there are 180,000 homeless people in the state, 70,000 in LA County, 7,000 in Orange County, and then 105,000 elsewhere. So there's a gigantic reservoir there that could be pushed places. Okay, and then, but right when we get to questions, I can see I've tested your patience to the limits here. What is the fire going to do? I mean, in short, like, who knows? It's still very early, but it did directly displace permanently displace at least 12,000 people. So that's like, what is it, 16%? That's basically adding another 16% to the homeless population in Los Angeles. It won't do that because many of these people will not go through the system to get rehoused. They have means. They're not homeless in the same necessarily way. But it's a lot of people. And more importantly, it destroyed maybe 19,000 destroyed 12,000 homes. In 2024, LA only permitted 19,000 homes. So like this is 63% of, no, LA County. It destroyed over half of the amount of housing that LA County permits in a whole year. So it would take almost a whole year to just, if we gave all the housing back to people who lost it, it would take a year's worth of permitting. So that's a lot. Obviously, unhoused folks were directly displaced if they had interim housing located in a fire evacuation zone. That was not such a big number. But what's really underlying all of this is like, you're looking at a rental market in Los Angeles with a 96% occupancy rate. There just are no units. There are no units. I know we like to say that there, like 3.9% of a big number is a big number, but when you account for the ones that are being repaired or the ones that are undergoing inspection, there just are not a lot of places for people to move into. And by displacing so many people from their pre-existing home, they're going to be competing with unhoused folk for the same units. Permanent supportive housing does not mean always a big building with a caseworker in the bottom where you're living together with people who have left homelessness. There are plenty of mom and pop landlords where it's just a unit. It's just a unit in a building. You got a 12-unit dingbat like mine. One unit might be someone who used to be homeless, and their caseworker comes and visits them every once in a while. A lot of the housing stock is common, and that fuels that low vacancy rate. So how can you get involved? Well, in the Palisades, for example, there's resistance already to incorporating affordable housing in the rebuilding plans. And you might say, well, okay, we don't have to build affordable housing in the Palisades. But I can tell you there's resistance all the time everywhere to building affordable housing. And I think to tack on to what Sue said before, showing up and saying, hey, you know what, actually, we don't oppose affordable housing. We welcome affordable housing. I can tell you that's a surprise to people on the other side of the dais. They are used to people who come from a certain socioeconomic stratum and look a certain way to say, don't do something. When they start hearing, do something, their calculus changes. And I'm just saying that as a policy analyst. I'm not saying that as someone who's been on the other side of the dais or someone who's run for anything before. And I'm not even saying, this is how you advocate for anything. I'm just saying this is something, if you wanted to act, it's very difficult for us to end poverty as single individuals. It's very difficult for us to house a person or take care of their psychosocial and physical needs. But it is something where we can show up at a meeting and express our enthusiasm for various things that might meet these objectives. So that's it from me. I want to thank you for being very generous with your time and listening to me ramble on about numbers and stuff. I'm happy to talk about qualitative, feelingsy things and how people move, but as a Randite, I wanted to make sure I gave you the facts. So those facts are homelessness has outpaced housing construction in LA County for many years, and until that changes, it's difficult to see a way out of the crisis. Homelessness is rising among various at-risk populations, women, racial minorities, sexual and gender minorities, people with drug addiction challenges, and seniors. Sleeping without any dwelling whatsoever, rough sleeping, is becoming increasingly prevalent, and that's outside of the strategies that we've designed to address homelessness, which is very worrisome to me. That's what's keeping me up at night right now. But hopefully some of these initiatives that we've kind of kicked into high gear in the face of the oncoming Olympics will do some good. So thank you so much. Who's going to do questions? It's question time. Oh, that's a really great question. What percentage are children? In terms of individual children solo without families, very, very low, like in the low hundreds. In terms of children in families, it's higher. I don't know the number off the top of my head. What I will say is that LAUSD frequently quotes a much higher number. Like when you ask the schools how many of your kids are experiencing homelessness, the number that sticks in my head, and to the internet you'll have to fact check this, is like it's enough to fill Dodger Stadium 6 times. I don't know what that number is, but that's a big number. And that was accurate, I believe, as of like 2021. So I don't know. It's probably hard to know, but just lone children who have like no family, that is a very, very, very small number, thankfully. But the schools probably have the best estimate.
Do they go to the top of a list?
Families tend to, yes. Like if you call 211, which in Los Angeles is the way you go to get shelter, if you are a family with young children, you will be prioritized. So the question was, what fraction of the unhoused population are undocumented immigrants? I don't know the exact statistic off the top of my head. I'm not sure if it's known, but I can tell you that all of the services see a non-zero number of people who are undocumented immigrants in their unhoused population on some cadence. And there have been news stories about how some of those folks that were bussed in from other jurisdictions were landed on Skid Row. So I don't have a number for you, but there is a proportion of the unhoused population that are undocumented immigrants, and that, of course, imposes other challenges because many of the services that are paid for by the federal government are only available to citizens. So that can also make it challenging for service providers to meet the needs of their clients. So the challenge of building tiny home villages. I can't comment on Long Beaches, but we have had similar issues in Los Angeles. So, it's not quite as simple as putting temporary structures on a field. In Los Angeles, for example, if they're going to stay up for more than a year, they need to have there are special wiring and plumbing requirements. Oftentimes, unless you have the correct kind of tiny home, you have to bury those cables and stuff underground. So this is sort of how you can end up hearing like a $5,000 tiny home ended up costing $120,000. It's not the home, it's the infrastructure. And so we've seen this, there are numerous instances of this that sort of arise, which make it difficult to find places. The other thing I'll say is there's always a push to build things on municipal land. And there are just sort of survey after survey of everybody comes in and says we should build on city-owned land. And then there's a combination of, well, the land isn't amenable because it's been tainted by some environmental issue, or in the rare instances where there can be pushback from community members. So basically my answer to you is like it's often infrastructure problems that manifest as not building tiny homes as opposed to why can't we just put these tiny homes someplace. Some of these restrictions, I believe, were supposed to be laxened by like the emergency declarations that have happened. But I don't know to the extent that is true. It seems like the county and the city are both really shifting towards motel purchases, specifically the master leasing of entire buildings for this purpose. That seems to be the preferred modality to move forward. And so I feel like, I'm not saying that people aren't pursuing the tiny homes, but in my opinion and in my experience, it's become less of the part of the conversation.